"You'll never make the shot," the captain laughed, his words cutting through the air like a knife. The female sniper merely adjusted her scope, focusing on a target that professionals deemed impossible. Before anyone could stop her, the general's body crumpled to the ground, 2,400 meters away. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the training grounds, transforming the sand into a shimmering sea of heat waves. Sergeant Eliza Rowan lay prone on the firing platform, sweat trickling down her temples as she adjusted her position. The weight of the rifle pressed against her shoulder, familiar and reassuring, amid the whispers that followed her everywhere on base. "You'll never make the shot." Captain Doyle's voice cut through the desert air, sharp and dismissive. His laughter rippled through the small gathering of soldiers, an invitation for others to join in his mockery. 2,400 meters? Not even the best marksman in the unit could hit that target. Eliza didn't respond, focusing instead on her breathing. In, out, slow and steady. The sergeant had spent countless hours perfecting her technique. Yet here she was, being challenged like a novice. She could feel the eyes of her fellow soldiers boring into her back, some hopeful, others skeptical, most simply waiting for her to fail. In the distance, General Harker stood with his back to her, his rigid posture a testament to his absolute confidence. The general hadn't even bothered to acknowledge the exercise, convinced of his safety at such an impossible range. His khaki uniform blended with the desert backdrop, making him little more than a speck through her scope. "The wind's picking up, Sergeant," Lieutenant Marquez murmured from beside her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. 5 knots from the west. Unlike Doyle, the lieutenant's words carried no judgment, just information. His presence offered a small comfort in the hostile environment. Eliza adjusted her aim, calculating for wind resistance, bullet drop, and the Earth's rotation. Her finger hovered over the trigger as Corporal Jennings snickered behind her. "$10 says she misses by 20 meters, he whispered loudly enough for her to hear. The sergeant's future at the base hung in the balance. After months of subtle exclusion, sideways glances in the mess hall, and accidentally misplaced equipment, this moment would either cement her position or confirm every doubt. She was the outsider, the woman trying to prove herself in a unit that had already decided her worth. Through her scope, she could see the general shift his weight slightly. The target was nearly imperceptible at this distance, a small metal plate attached to a post several meters from where Harker stood. Hitting it would trigger a flag to rise, visible to all observers. Eliza drew a final breath, steadying herself against the platform. Her reputation, her future, and her very sense of belonging trembled in that moment, balanced on the edge of her trigger finger. The desert fell silent, as if the entire world was holding its breath with her. Sergeant Eliza Rowan settled into position, the hot Arizona sand seeping through her uniform. The desert heat distorted the air between her and the target, General Harker standing confidently at 2,400 meters away. She could almost hear Captain Doyle's mocking laughter echoing in her mind. Sweat trickled down her forehead, threatening to blur her vision. She blinked it away, refusing to let something so trivial interfere with what might be the most important shot of her career. The rifle felt like an extension of her body as she calibrated for distance, elevation, and the capricious desert wind that could send her bullet astray. 3 degrees right, she whispered to herself, adjusting minutely. Her breathing slowed deliberately. Inhale, hold, exhale partially. The world around her faded away. No more jeers from fellow soldiers. No more doubts about her capabilities. Just Eliza, her weapon, and the impossible distance between them and vindication. Through her scope, the general appeared as a tiny figure, almost arrogant in his certainty that no one could make such a shot. He stood tall, hands clasped behind his back, completely unaware that he had become the focal point of her entire existence. The sergeant's finger hovered over the trigger as she performed the final mental calculations. Wind speed, 12 knots. Temperature, 97 degrees. Humidity, minimal. Bullet drop, significant. She factored in the Earth's rotation and the mirage effect created by the heat waves. Every variable had to be perfect. She exhaled halfway and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle seemed oddly muted in the vast desert expanse. Time slowed as the bullet traveled its impossibly long journey. For nearly 3 seconds, an eternity in a sniper's world, Eliza remained frozen, barely breathing. Then it happened. General Harker suddenly dropped to one knee, his hand reaching for the small target pinned to his shoulder, the one she'd hit dead center. His head snapped toward her position, visible even at this distance. The silence that followed was deafening. Every soldier who had gathered to witness her failure stood motionless, jaws slack with disbelief. Someone whispered, "Holy shit," the words carrying across the stunned training ground. Lieutenant Marquez was the first to break the spell, a slow smile spreading across his face as he nodded in acknowledgement. Even Corporal Jennings couldn't hide his astonishment, though his eyes narrowed with something darker than mere surprise. Captain Doyle's face had drained of color. His earlier confidence evaporated like morning dew under the desert sun. The officer's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, his mockery silenced by her precision. Eliza allowed herself a small, private smile as she began breaking down her rifle. The impossible shot had been made. The barracks would never be the same again. The mess hall buzzed with hushed conversations that evening, punctuated by the metallic scrape of utensils against trays. Sergeant Eliza Rowan felt the weight of every glance as she moved through the line. Her tray balanced carefully in hands that had been steady enough to make a shot most considered impossible just hours earlier. "Lucky wind," someone muttered as she passed. "Fluke shot," whispered another. The words followed her like persistent desert flies, impossible to swat away. Captain Doyle sat with a cluster of officers, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. Though his smirk had faltered when the general dropped, he'd recovered quickly, now gesturing animatedly to Lieutenant Marquez and others. Eliza caught fragments of their conversation, something about statistical improbabilities and favorable conditions. "Mind if I join you?" she asked a group from her unit, forcing confidence into her voice. They shifted awkwardly, making space without meeting her eyes. Corporal Jennings, seated at the far end, made a show of checking his watch and standing. "Just finished," he announced, though his tray was half full. The ritual silence of dinner felt heavier tonight. Normally, Eliza appreciated the quiet focus of mealtime after long training days, but now the silence seemed loaded with unspoken judgments. She chewed mechanically, tasting nothing but the bitterness of isolation. A few tables away, she noticed some of the newer recruits watching her with undisguised curiosity. One nodded respectfully before being elbowed by his companion. Even admiration felt dangerous here, as if acknowledging her achievement might violate some unwritten code. Back in the barracks, Eliza sat on her bunk, finally alone with thoughts that had been circling all day. The shot had been perfect, she knew that. Years of training, countless hours adjusting for wind and distance had prepared her for that moment. Yet doubt crept in like the evening chill. Was this victory, or just another reason for them to wait for her to fail? The next time she stepped onto the range, expectations would be impossibly high. One miss, one slight error, and they'd have their confirmation. Today had been mere chance. Her hands trembled as she cleaned her rifle, the routine maintenance suddenly requiring intense concentration. These same hands had been perfectly steady when it mattered most, yet now betrayed the pressure she hid from everyone else. From across the room, she caught Lieutenant Marquez watching her, his expression unreadable. He nodded once before turning away, leaving Eliza to wonder if she'd found an ally or just another skeptic waiting for her inevitable fall. She exhaled slowly, methodically reassembling her weapon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, or to fail spectacularly. The desert was unforgiving that way. So was the military. The desert sky was still peppered with stars when Sergeant Eliza Rowan assembled with her unit for the annual endurance trial. The cool, pre-dawn air was deceptive. Everyone knew Arizona. Captain Doyle stood at the front, his posture rigid as he outlined the 20-mile course through punishing terrain. "This separates the soldiers from the tourists," he announced, his eyes lingering on Eliza. "Some of you might be good at party tricks, but endurance reveals true character." The trial began with the first rays of sunlight breaking over the distant mountains. Eliza started strong, her pace measured and confident. By mile 5, sweat had already soaked through her uniform, and the temperature climbed relentlessly. She could see Lieutenant Marquez ahead, his form steady and practiced. Behind her, she heard Corporal Jennings' labored breathing, unusually close, keeping tabs on her, no doubt. By mile 12, the sun hung directly overhead, beating down without mercy. Eliza's legs burned with each step, her lungs fighting for air that felt like fire. 3 soldiers had already dropped out, receiving medical attention from the support team following in a transport truck. The water in her canteen had grown tepid, offering little relief. "Looking rough there, Sergeant," Jennings taunted as he passed her, his face red, but wearing a smirk. "Maybe making fancy shots doesn't translate to real soldiering." Eliza said nothing, conserving her energy. Mile 15 brought the most challenging section, a steep incline covered in loose shale. Her vision blurred as dehydration took its toll. Each step became a negotiation with her body, which screamed for her to stop. At mile 18, she collapsed. Her legs simply gave out, sending her sprawling onto the scorching ground. The medical team started toward her, but Eliza raised her hand to stop them. Her cracked lips bled as she forced herself to stand again. Every fiber of her being wanted to quit. Through the heat shimmer, she saw General Harker observing from a ridge, his expression unreadable. Captain Doyle stood beside him, arms crossed, waiting for her failure. "Not today," she whispered to herself. Eliza forced her legs to move, one excruciating step after another. She focused on the rhythm of her breathing, on the distant finish line where Marquez waited, having completed the course 30 minutes earlier. When she finally crossed the finish line, third from last but still standing, she didn't collapse. Instead, she stood tall, meeting Doyle's gaze directly. The other soldiers, even those who doubted her, nodded with newfound respect. She hadn't just survived, she had refused to be broken. That night in the mess hall, the usual chatter fell silent when she entered. Then Marquez raised his cup of bitter coffee in a subtle salute, and others followed. No words were needed. The desert had tested her, and she had answered. The Arizona nights brought a different rhythm to the military base. As temperatures dropped, soldiers gathered in small clusters throughout the barracks, their faces illuminated by dim lights as they nursed cups of bitter coffee. These evening rituals were sacred, moments when the day's drills were dissected, hometown stories exchanged, and bonds forged through shared laughter. Sergeant Eliza Rowan watched from the periphery, her own mug clutched between calloused hands. She recognized these gatherings for what they were, the invisible architecture of unit cohesion. Yet each time she approached, conversations would shift or pause entirely. The silence felt deliberate, heavy with unspoken judgment. "They'll come around," Lieutenant Marquez said one evening, settling beside her on the weathered bench outside the barracks. The officer's presence was unexpected but welcome. That shot rattled more than just the general. Eliza nodded, watching steam rise from her cup. "I didn't join to make friends." "No? But you'll need allies," Marquez replied. his voice low enough that only she could hear. A unit functions on trust, not intimidation or ego. That's something Captain Doyle never understood. The lieutenant's words offered rare comfort. Unlike the others, he seemed to value skill and determination over tradition and hierarchy. His quiet support felt like the first genuine connection she'd made since arriving. "Some nights I wonder if I made a mistake coming here," she admitted, surprising herself with the confession. Marquez studied the stars overhead. The best soldiers often ask themselves that question. The dangerous ones never do. Across the yard, Corporal Jennings leaned against a doorway, his narrowed eyes tracking their conversation. When their gazes met, he didn't look away. Instead, his lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile before he turned back to his circle of friends. "Watch him," Marquez warned, following her line of sight. His father was passed over for promotion 3 times. The chip on his shoulder has its own weight classification. The warning wasn't necessary. Eliza had already cataloged the corporal's growing resentment, had noticed how he positioned himself as an unofficial leader among those who found her presence disruptive. As the night deepened, the sounds of the desert intensified, insects chirping, the occasional coyote call, the wind whispering through nearby scrub. Eliza listened to these rhythms, finding comfort in their constancy while human connections remained elusive. "Give it time," Marquez said, rising to leave. "Respect isn't granted with rank or even with one impossible shot. It's earned day by day." After he departed, Eliza remained, watching the barracks windows go dark one by one, feeling both apart from and essential to the unit she served. A contradiction she would need to resolve if she hoped to truly belong. The small town near the base transformed itself for the annual Desert Heritage Festival. Strings of colorful lanterns crisscrossing the main street like constellations against the darkening Arizona sky. For Sergeant Eliza Rowan and her unit, the festival represented more than just a break from the relentless training regimen. It was a rare chance to breathe beyond the confines of military discipline. "First round's on me," Lieutenant Marquez announced, guiding their small group toward a local restaurant where tables spilled onto the sidewalk. The smell of grilled meat and spices hung in the air, a welcome change from mess hall monotony. Eliza hesitated at the edge of the group, unsure of her place. She'd grown accustomed to isolation, to the sideways glances and whispered doubts. But tonight, something shifted. Perhaps it was the music, or the way the desert heat gave way to a gentle evening breeze, but she found herself drawn into conversation. "You ever been to one of these before?" Corporal Jennings asked, surprising her with the lack of his usual edge. The soldier's face looked different in the warm glow of the festival lights. Younger, less hardened by rivalry. "First time," she admitted, accepting a paper cup of sweet tea from a vendor. "We moved around too much when I was growing up." As the night deepened, stories flowed as freely as drinks. Eliza shared tales of her first shooting competitions, and for once, her teammates listened without judgment. Even Captain Doyle seemed less rigid, laughing at a local's joke about city folks in the desert. "You've got a good eye," said an elderly man who had been watching their group from his craft stall. His weathered hands worked methodically, adjusting the components of what appeared to be a custom rifle scope. "Military trained?" "Yes, sir," Eliza replied, drawn to his workbench. The craftsman nodded knowingly. "Thought so. Been making these for 30 years. Started after my own time in service." He held up the modified scope, its brass fittings catching the lantern light. "This one's special. Compensates better for heat mirages. Common problem out here." When he insisted she take it as a gift, Eliza protested, but the old man was firm. "Consider it my contribution to whoever's watching your back out there." Walking back to the transport trucks later that night, the modified scope carefully wrapped and tucked in her pocket, Eliza felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. For the first time since arriving at the base, she felt connected, not just to her team, whose laughter now included her, but to this harsh, beautiful land and the people who called it home. The desert practice range shimmered under the Arizona sun as Sergeant Eliza Rowan adjusted her rifle position. Something felt off. The sand around her position had been disturbed, not by the natural patterns of wind, but in a deliberate manner that raised her suspicions. She'd been at this base long enough to recognize the difference. As she peered through her scope, a sudden gust of sand hit her directly in the face. Eliza jerked back, blinking rapidly as tiny particles stung her eyes. This wasn't natural. The wind hadn't changed direction, and the sand seemed to come from nowhere. "Bad luck, Rowan," came a voice laced with false sympathy. Corporal Jennings stood several yards away, his smirk barely concealed. Desert's unpredictable. The sergeant wiped her eyes and examined her equipment. The fine sand had worked its way into the rifle's mechanisms, exactly where it would cause the most trouble. Her years of experience told her this was no accident. Someone had positioned a small pile of sand where it would be disturbed when she settled into position. "Need help cleaning that out?" Jennings asked, approaching with exaggerated concern. "Wouldn't want our star shooter to miss her next impossible target." Eliza met his gaze steadily. "I've got it, Corporal." Her voice remained professional, betraying none of the anger bubbling beneath. Later, in the barracks, Lieutenant Marquez noticed her meticulously cleaning her rifle. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. "Just some sand issues," she replied, not wanting to sound paranoid without proof. But the lieutenant wasn't fooled. "Jennings has been talking more than usual," Marquez observed. "His father was passed over for promotion 3 times. He seems to think the military owes his family something." The sabotage marked a turning point. What had been whispered doubt now crystallized into active opposition. Each morning, Eliza checked her equipment thoroughly before training. Each success she achieved was met with claims of favoritism or luck. Each minor failure was magnified and circulated through the mess hall with gleeful exaggeration. The rivalry with Jennings transformed every training exercise into a silent battle. The corporal watched her constantly, waiting for mistakes, creating small obstacles that could be dismissed as accidents if questioned. Captain Doyle noticed, but did nothing, his silence an implicit approval of the treatment. General Harker remained distant, observing the dynamics with cold calculation. For Eliza, the stakes had changed. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about surviving in an environment designed to break her. Every shot she took, every order she followed, every challenge she met became another stand against those who wanted to see her fail. The desert training ground, once merely harsh, had become hostile territory. Captain Doyle paced his office, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the military-issue desk where Eliza Rowan's performance reports lay scattered. His fingers drummed against the folder containing her latest evaluation, another exceptional score that twisted like a knife in his pride. "Problem with Sergeant Rowan?" Lieutenant Colonel Hayes asked from the doorway, noticing the captain's scowl. "She's disrupting unit cohesion," Doyle replied, carefully choosing words that wouldn't reveal his true concerns. "The men are distracted by her methods." What he couldn't admit was how Eliza's impossible shot had undermined his authority. Every day since, he'd watched soldiers glance her way with newfound respect, respect that had once been directed exclusively at him. 20 years in service, built on tradition and hierarchy, now threatened by a sergeant who refused to know her place. That evening, Doyle arranged a private meeting with General Harker. The officers' quarters were sparse but comfortable, adorned only with medals and a single family photograph. "With all due respect, sir, I believe Sergeant Rowan's continued presence creates unrealistic expectations," he explained, standing rigidly at attention. "Her unconventional approach contradicts established training protocols." The general studied him with cold eyes. "Are you suggesting I remove my best marksman because she makes you uncomfortable, Captain?" "Not uncomfortable, sir. Concerned about discipline." Later that week, Eliza noticed her name mysteriously absent from the advanced tactical training roster. Then her equipment requisitions began disappearing. her requests for additional range time denied without explanation. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. "Lieutenant Marquez, have I done something wrong?" she asked during their morning briefing. Marquez hesitated. "Politics, Rowan. Someone's been in Harker's ear." She didn't need him to name names. The captain's calculated glances and sudden interest in reviewing her past performance told her everything. What had begun as mockery had evolved into something more dangerous, a deliberate campaign to undermine her position and credibility. During mess hall, Eliza overheard fragments of conversation from the officers' table. Doyle's voice carried just enough for her to catch phrases like "lucky shot" and "liability in real combat." The sergeant gripped her tray tighter, but kept her expression neutral. She'd faced skepticism before, weathered doubt and mockery. This was different, more calculated, more insidious. But if Doyle thought bureaucratic maneuvering would force her out, he'd underestimated her resolve. That night, she cleaned her rifle with methodical precision, each movement a silent promise. She hadn't survived the desert, the impossible shot, and Jennings' sabotage to be defeated by paperwork and whispers. The captain might control the assignments, but he couldn't take away what she'd already proven. General Harker stood at the center of the training field, his weathered face expressionless as he addressed the assembled unit. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Arizona desert as he singled out Sergeant Eliza Rowan. "Sergeant, you'll take point on the cliff face extraction drill," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent ranks. "Solo, no support team. The assignment was unprecedented, a two-person minimum exercise made deliberately impossible for one." Eliza felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on her back as she acknowledged the order with a crisp, "Yes, sir." Lieutenant Marquez caught her eye briefly, concern evident in his gaze. They both knew what this was. Not training, but a public execution of her reputation. Over the next 3 weeks, General Harker's special assignments for Eliza became a regular spectacle. Each task seemed designed with meticulous precision to expose weakness. Overnight surveillance with faulty equipment, navigation exercises with deliberately incorrect coordinates, marksmanship drills with compromised ammunition. "He's trying to break you," Marquez confided, during a rare private moment as they checked equipment in the supply shed. "I've never seen him this fixated on proving someone doesn't belong." Eliza tightened the strap on her pack. "Then I'll just have to disappoint him." The following day brought perhaps the most audacious challenge yet. The general ordered her to complete the desert endurance course carrying twice the standard weight, a burden that had sent soldiers twice her size to the medical tent. Captain Doyle didn't bother hiding his satisfaction. "Looks like our shooting star's about to burn out," he remarked, loudly enough for the entire mess hall to hear. But something unexpected happened during these trials. With each impossible task, Eliza developed new techniques, improvised solutions, and pushed her limits beyond what even she thought possible. The cliff extraction became a masterclass in minimal gear ascension. The faulty surveillance equipment taught her to rely on her senses instead of technology. Most surprising was the reaction from her unit. What began as entertainment, watching the woman who made the impossible shot finally fail, gradually transformed into grudging respect. Even Corporal Jennings, her most vocal critic, fell silent when she returned from the doubled-weight endurance course, exhausted but standing. "Still think it was luck?" she asked him as she passed, her voice barely above a whisper. General Harker's expression grew increasingly severe with each success. His tests became more public, more unreasonable, and more transparent in their intent. Yet with each new challenge, Eliza's reputation solidified, not as someone who had gotten lucky once, but as a soldier who simply refused to accept failure as an option. The morning sun glinted off Eliza Rowan's rifle as she settled into position. Today's exercise would be observed by half the unit, including Captain Doyle, whose arms were crossed expectantly. The training session involved hitting a series of targets at varying distances, a seemingly routine drill that had suddenly become anything but ordinary. Through her scope, Eliza lined up the first shot perfectly. She squeezed the trigger with practiced precision, but the bullet veered wildly off course. Frowning, she adjusted and tried again. Same result. Something was wrong. "Problem, Sergeant?" Doyle called out, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. Eliza examined her standard-issue scope and immediately spotted the issue. The elevation adjustment had been tampered with, the mechanism subtly damaged. Her gaze flickered briefly toward Corporal Jennings, whose face remained carefully neutral despite the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Just a minor equipment issue, sir," she replied evenly, refusing to give either of them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. As the other soldiers murmured among themselves, Lieutenant Marquez approached. "Time's running out, Rowan," he said quietly. "Do you have a backup plan?" The sergeant's mind flashed to the modified scope gifted to her by the craftsman during the town's festival, currently stowed in her gear bag. "I do, actually." While Doyle conferred with other officers, Eliza quickly retrieved the custom scope and attached it to the rifle. It wasn't military standard, but the craftsman had designed it with exceptional clarity and durability. "That's not regulation equipment," Jennings pointed out loudly. "The exercise parameters don't specify required optics," Marquez countered. "Only accuracy results." Eliza had mere minutes to familiarize herself with the new scope subtleties. Its sight picture was different, the adjustments more sensitive. She would need to recalibrate her entire approach. When her turn came again, the sergeant took a deep breath. The first target appeared smaller through the new optics, but somehow clearer. She fired. Direct hit. Then another, and another. By the time she finished the course, even Captain Doyle couldn't deny her performance. The modified scope had not only worked, it had allowed her to achieve her highest accuracy rate yet. "Impressive adaptation, Sergeant," General Harker commented, appearing seemingly from nowhere. "Though I wonder why your standard equipment failed so conveniently." His implication hung in the air. Was she receiving special treatment? Had she engineered the malfunction herself? "Sometimes we must work with what we have, sir," Eliza replied, meeting his gaze steadily. That evening, whispers circulated through the barracks, some claiming sabotage, others favoritism. But among a growing number of soldiers, the sentiment was different. Respect for a woman who could turn disaster into triumph through sheer resourcefulness. The desert transformed at night. What had been a sun-scorched expanse by day became an alien landscape under the silver glow of the moon. Sergeant Eliza Rowan pulled her jacket tighter as the temperature plummeted, her breath forming small clouds in the cold night air. The navigation drill had begun 2 hours earlier, with clear instructions. Find your way back to base using only the stars and your wits. What the instructors hadn't mentioned was the sudden weather change. Cloud cover now obscured most of the stars, leaving Eliza with fragmented celestial guidance. The familiar rock formations she'd memorized during daytime exercises morphed into menacing shadows, playing tricks on her perception. "East," she whispered to herself, recalling Lieutenant Marquez's advice about trusting her training over her fear. The soldier checked her compass, confirming her direction before pushing forward through the loose sand that seemed to pull at her boots with each step. Hours passed. Eliza's water supply dwindled to half a canteen. The isolation pressed in on her, not unlike the isolation she felt daily in the barracks. Here, at least, the desert made no pretense of acceptance before rejecting her. A coyote howled somewhere to her right. The sergeant paused, listening. The Arizona wildlife had patterns, rhythms that can serve as guidance if you paid attention. During her first month on base, she'd spent evenings observing rather than joining the mess hall banter. Those quiet observations now proved invaluable. When she stumbled across a dried creek bed, Eliza recognized it from previous training runs. Relief flooded through her tired body. This landmark wasn't on the expected route, but it would lead her home. Following its winding path, She calculated she'd added 4 miles to her journey, but gained certainty. Dawn broke as the training facility appeared on the horizon. Eliza's uniform was dust-coated, her face wind-chapped, but her steps remained steady. Several officers waited at the checkpoint, including Captain Doyle, whose disappointed expression told her everything. He'd expected her to fail. Sergeant Rowan reporting back from navigation exercise. "Sir," she announced, voice hoarse but strong. General Harker stepped forward, checking his watch. "You're the first one back," he stated flatly, though his eyes narrowed slightly. Even after the weather turned, Corporal Jennings arrived 30 minutes later with 3 other soldiers, their exhausted faces registering shock at seeing her already there. The rivalry in his eyes burned hotter than before. That night in the barracks, the whispers changed tone. No one could dismiss her achievement as mere luck anymore. The desert had tested her, stripped away pretense, and revealed her core strength. Eliza slept deeply for the first time in months. The desert sand still embedded under her fingernails, a reminder that sometimes being lost was the only way to truly find yourself. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Sergeant Eliza Rowan and her unit assembled for the high-stakes team drill. Sweat trickled down her spine, but it wasn't the heat causing the tension in her shoulders. Corporal David Jennings stood across from her, his eyes narrowed with undisguised contempt. "Teams of 2, barked the instructor. "Rowan and Jennings, you're paired for the obstacle course." A collective intake of breath rippled through the unit. Everyone knew about their rivalry, but this was the first time they'd been forced to work together directly. Eliza nodded curtly, professional despite the churning in her stomach. "Try to keep up," Jennings muttered as they approached the starting line. "My family's been military for 4 generations. We don't need outsiders showing us how it's done." Eliza ignored the jab, focusing instead on the course ahead. They needed to navigate obstacles, communicate positions, and hit targets with precision timing. Success required absolute trust, something conspicuously absent between them. The whistle blew. They moved in tandem initially, muscle memory from months of training kicking in. But at the 3rd checkpoint, Jennings deliberately veered off course, leaving Eliza exposed during a crucial covering maneuver. "Corporal!" she hissed through her communication device. "Position compromised. Adjust." "Sorry, Sergeant," he replied, insincerity dripping from every word. "Must have misunderstood the plan." Lieutenant Marquez watched from the observation tower, his expression grim. This wasn't just about 2 soldiers anymore. The entire unit had stopped to witness the confrontation brewing for months. At the final obstacle, Jennings fumbled a rope transfer, nearly dropping 20 feet to the ground. Without hesitation, Eliza lunged forward, grabbing his wrist. For one tense moment, their eyes locked, his filled with surprise, hers with determination. "I've got you," she said firmly, hauling him up with strength that belied her frame. They finished the course in silence, their time mediocre at best. As they stood catching their breath, Jennings finally spoke. "Why'd you do that? I've been nothing but trouble for you." "Because we're a unit," Eliza answered simply. "Your family history doesn't matter to me. What matters is what you do now, today." The corporal stared at her, conflict evident in his expression. Around them, other soldiers watched, suddenly uncomfortable with their own silent complicity in the rivalry. Captain Doyle approached, clipboard in hand. "Disappointing performance," he noted coldly, but his eyes lingered on Jennings rather than Eliza. That evening in the mess hall, the usual segregation remained, but something had shifted. The confrontation had forced everyone to recognize the cost of their internal divisions, how petty rivalries undermined their effectiveness as a unit. Eliza sat alone as always, until a tray clattered down opposite hers. Jennings didn't speak, didn't even look at her directly, but his presence said enough. The desert night had fallen, bringing a welcome chill after the scorching day. Sergeant Eliza Rowan sat on the edge of the base perimeter, her rifle disassembled beside her as she methodically cleaned each part. The distant lights of the barracks cast long shadows across the sand, offering a rare moment of solitude. "Mind if I join you?" Lieutenant Marquez approached, two steaming cups in hand. The familiar scent of the bitter barracks coffee wafted through the air. Eliza nodded, accepting the cup gratefully. "Couldn't sleep either, sir?" Marquez settled beside her, his usual confident demeanor softened by the night. "Some nights are harder than others." He stared into the darkness, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. "You did well today," he finally said. "The way you handled that navigation exercise impressed even the general, though he'd never admit it." She snorted softly. "One small victory in an endless war. That's what I wanted to talk about." The lieutenant's voice dropped. "I've been thinking about leaving the service." The confession caught her off guard. Marquez had always seemed the perfect soldier, disciplined, respected, unshakable. "But why?" she asked. "You're the one person everyone respects here." He laughed without humor. "Respect doesn't silence the doubts. Every decision I make, I question. Every order I give, I wonder if it's the right one." His fingers tightened around his cup. 15 years in, and some mornings I still feel like an imposter. Eliza stared at him, this revelation reshaping everything she thought she knew. "I never would have guessed." "That's the point, isn't it? We all wear our armor." Marquez looked at her directly. "Even the best of us struggle, Eliza. Leadership isn't about being fearless. It's about moving forward despite the fear." The stars seemed brighter somehow, as his words settled between them. For months, she had been fighting to prove herself perfect, unbreakable. "What keeps you going then?" she asked. "The people who depend on me, the ones I can help." He nodded toward her reassembled rifle. "And finding meaning in the small victories." They talked until the coffee grew cold, about doubt and resilience, about the military's flaws and virtues. For the first time, Eliza saw her mentor as fully human, not just an officer to impress, but someone who understood her struggles intimately. As they walked back to the barracks, Marquez stopped. "Remember, Sergeant, perfection is impossible. Persistence isn't." That night, as she lay in her bunk, listening to the quiet breathing of her teammates, Eliza realized something had shifted. Her goal was no longer just to prove herself, but to lead with the same empathy and honesty Marquez had shown her. The sky darkened without warning, transforming from clear blue to an ominous amber in minutes. Sergeant Eliza Rowan had experienced sandstorms before, but this one approached with unusual ferocity, a towering wall of dust that devoured the horizon. "Everyone inside!" she shouted, her voice barely audible above the rising howl of wind. The training exercise they'd been conducting dissolved into chaos as visibility dropped to mere feet. Sand particles stung exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. Captain Doyle stood frozen for a moment, his usual commanding presence shattered by the sudden threat. "Follow protocol," he barked, but his eyes betrayed panic. When the first violent gust hit, sending equipment tumbling across the yard, he made a decision that would haunt his reputation for months to come. The captain turned and sprinted toward the command building, abandoning his unit without further instruction. "Sir," Eliza called after him, but he was already gone, swallowed by the swirling brown haze. The communication devices crackled with static, rendering them useless. Soldiers scattered, some heading toward the wrong buildings in the disorientation. Eliza's mind raced through the base layout, calculating distances and dangers. "Form up," she commanded, her sergeant's authority cutting through the chaos. "Corporal Jennings, take point. Everyone link arms." Even Jennings, her most persistent rival, recognized the necessity of cooperation. He grabbed the nearest soldier's arm, forming the beginning of a human chain. Eliza positioned herself at the rear, ensuring no one would be left behind. "3 steps forward, then pause," she directed, guiding them through the blinding storm. A group moved as one organism, feeling their way toward the nearest shelter. When one soldier stumbled, the entire line halted until they regained footing. Inside the barracks, Lieutenant Marquez was organizing the soldiers who had made it to safety. His face brightened with relief when Eliza's group stumbled through the door, covered in dust, but intact. "Head count," she ordered, her voice hoarse from shouting against the wind. One by one, names were called, each response lifting a weight from her shoulders. Later, as the storm continued to rage outside, the soldiers huddled in the common area, sharing water and brushing sand from their uniforms. The usual division seemed temporarily forgotten in the shared experience of survival. "You did good out there," Marquez said quietly, handing Eliza a canteen. Not everyone would have kept their head. She nodded, too exhausted for words. Across the room, she caught Jennings watching her, his expression unreadable but lacking its usual hostility. When the base commander eventually called for a situation report, Doyle's absence was conspicuous. The story of who had led whom to safety spread quickly through the ranks, reshaping perceptions more effectively than any marksmanship display ever could. "Sergeant Rowan, effective immediately, you'll be training the new recruits," Colonel Matthews announced, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. The sandstorm had finally subsided, leaving the base covered in a fine layer of dust that seemed to have settled into Eliza's very soul. She stood ramrod straight, hiding her dismay. "Sir, with all due respect, I'm not an instructor." "You are now," he replied, sliding a folder across his desk. "6 newcomers, fresh out of basic. Considerate recognition of your recent performances." Eliza recognized the assignment for what it was, another test, possibly orchestrated by General Harker himself. Training rookies meant less time to focus on her own skills, less opportunity to prove herself in the challenges that mattered. The timing couldn't have been worse. The next morning, she faced her charges with thinly veiled frustration. 6 pairs of eager eyes stared back at her. Too green, too soft for the harshness of Arizona's unforgiving terrain. One recruit, barely 20, fumbled with his rifle assembly, while another couldn't seem to maintain proper stance. "Again," she ordered after their third failed attempt at a coordinated drill. "And this time, Martinez, keep your elbow tucked." Days blurred together. Eliza pushed them hard, perhaps too hard, her own frustrations bleeding into her instruction. When Private Chen broke down after failing to complete the obstacle course, something inside her shifted. "I can't do this," Chen whispered, dust clinging to tear-streaked cheeks. Eliza knelt beside the young woman, suddenly remembering her own struggles. "Everyone fails here first," she said quietly. "The desert doesn't care about your feelings. Neither does Captain Doyle or the General. But I do." The words surprised her as much as Chen. Vulnerability had always seemed dangerous, a weakness to be exploited. Yet here she was, offering it freely. She adjusted her approach after that day. Instead of demanding perfection, she shared stories of her own failures. When Ramirez couldn't hit a target at 800 meters, she demonstrated the breathing technique Lieutenant Marquez had once taught her. "Control your breath. Control the shot," she explained, guiding his posture with a patience she hadn't known she possessed. 2 weeks later, watching her squad execute a flawless tactical maneuver, Eliza felt something unfamiliar. Pride that had nothing to do with her own accomplishments. These weren't just bodies to be shaped into soldiers. They were extensions of herself, carrying forward lessons paid for with her sweat and determination. When Captain Doyle passed by with a dismissive glance, she no longer felt the sting she once would have. Her worth wasn't measured solely by his approval anymore. It lived in the confidence growing in her trainees' eyes. Lieutenant Marquez found Eliza at the edge of the training grounds, where the base's rigid geometry surrendered to the wild desert beyond. The evening light cast long shadows across the sand as he settled beside her on the weathered bench. "I've been thinking about my future, Eliza," he said, his voice unusually heavy. The lieutenant ran his hand through his cropped hair, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I'm putting in my papers if things don't change around here." Sergeant Rowan turned to face him, startled by the revelation. "Leave the military? But you've dedicated your whole life to this." 15 years, Marquez confirmed with a nod. "And I've watched good soldiers get crushed by politics and ego. What happened with you and Doyle, with Harker's impossible tasks? It's the same pattern I've seen destroy careers and lives." A military transport rumbled past, kicking up dust that danced in the fading light. Eliza watched it disappear toward the barracks, feeling the weight of his words settle on her shoulders. "The unit needs people like you," she said finally. "People who actually care about building something worth serving in." Marquez's laugh held no humor. "That's exactly why I can't stay if nothing changes. This isn't just about you proving yourself anymore, Eliza. It's about whether this place deserves people like us." His ultimatum hung in the desert air between them. The sergeant realized that her personal battle had grown into something larger. Her success or failure would influence Marquez's decision to stay, potentially reshaping the unit's future. "I never asked to be a symbol," she whispered. "None of us do," the lieutenant replied, standing. "But sometimes that's the role we're given." Over the next weeks, Eliza approached her duties with renewed purpose. She volunteered for additional responsibilities, spent extra hours helping struggling recruits with marksmanship, and deliberately included Jennings in team exercises despite their ongoing tension. During a particularly grueling night exercise, when Captain Doyle's instructions left the unit confused and vulnerable, she quietly reorganized their approach without undermining his authority. The success was attributed to the captain, but the soldiers knew who had guided them. Each small victory felt hollow compared to the magnitude of changing an entrenched culture. But Eliza persisted. She carried Marquez's confidence in her like armor against doubt, determined not to be the reason he abandoned his career. One evening in the mess hall, she caught his eye across the room. The lieutenant offered a subtle nod of approval as conversations flowed more naturally around her than ever before. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was progress worth fighting for. The base buzzed with unusual energy as a convoy of black vehicles rolled through the gates. Sergeant Eliza Rowan felt her stomach tighten. These weren't ordinary visitors, but Pentagon officials, foreign military attachés, and defense contractors, all gathered for the annual capabilities demonstration that had suddenly become her personal trial by fire. "Remember who's watching today," Captain Doyle whispered as he passed, his voice carrying a thinly veiled threat. "Don't embarrass us." The captain had personally selected her for the most technically challenging segment, not as an honor, but as a setup for public failure. Eliza checked her rifle methodically, fingers tracing each component with practiced precision. The modified scope from the town craftsman had become her secret advantage, its custom calibration perfectly matched to her shooting style. Lieutenant Marquez approached with a reassuring nod. "They're expecting a good show," he said quietly, "but I'm expecting something they'll never forget." The demonstration field had been transformed with bleachers, a PA system, and targets arranged at increasingly impossible distances. When her turn came, Eliza stepped forward into silence. The dignitaries leaned forward in their seats, programs listing her segment as Advanced Long-Range Precision Demonstration. She began with textbook shots, hitting conventional targets with mechanical perfection. But it was the finale that made sweat bead on her forehead, a series of moving targets at variable distances, culminating in one positioned almost 2,000 meters away, barely visible through heat haze. Eliza took a deep breath, mentally calculating wind speed, bullet drop, and rotation. The world narrowed to her breathing and the target. She squeezed the trigger. The first moving target fell, then the second. By the third, murmurs rippled through the audience. When the final, distant target shattered, stunned silence gave way to spontaneous applause. Even General Harker's stoic expression cracked with something resembling approval. "Impossible," muttered one foreign attaché, scribbling furiously in his notebook. Afterward, as Eliza secured her equipment, Corporal Jennings shouldered past. "Lucky day," he hissed, jealousy etched into every line of his face. But the triumph was undeniable. Senior officers who had never acknowledged her existence now sought introductions. A defense contractor discreetly offered his business card. For the first time, Eliza saw herself through outside eyes, not as an anomaly to be tested, but as an asset to be valued. That evening, Captain Doyle avoided the celebration dinner entirely. His absence spoke volumes about the shifting power dynamics. What had begun as his attempt to humiliate her had instead cemented her reputation beyond the base's boundaries. Eliza understood the victory was double-edged. She had gained admirers, but also deepened the resentment of those who felt threatened by her rise. The impossible shot that had started her journey was no longer just a legend. It was becoming her legacy. General Harker's aide delivered the summons at dusk, when the base was settling into its evening routines. Sergeant Eliza Rowan felt her stomach tighten as she made her way across the compound. Boots crunching on the Arizona gravel, the general's office stood apart from the other buildings, imposing in its isolation. "Enter," came the cold command when she knocked. General Harker sat behind his desk, his face illuminated by a single lamp. He didn't look up from his paperwork when Eliza saluted, making her hold the position until her arm ached. "At ease, Sergeant," he finally said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Do you know why you're here?" "No, sir," she replied, though suspicion crawled up her spine. The general leaned back, studying her with clinical detachment. "You've had quite the year, haven't you? Overcoming every obstacle, surpassing expectations." His tone made it clear these weren't compliments. "I've done my duty, sir." Harker's laugh was brittle. "Your duty, yes." He stood and moved to the window. The equipment failures, the impossible assignments, the isolation exercises. Did you ever wonder why they all fell to you? Eliza remained silent, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I engineered them," he said flatly. "Every challenge, every setback, I needed to find your breaking point." The revelation hit her like physical force. Months of struggle, of pushing beyond her limits, of earning every scrap of respect, all manipulated by the man before her. "May I ask why, sir?" she managed, keeping her voice steady. Harker turned, his silhouette sharp against the window. "Order, Sergeant. Discipline. This unit functions on hierarchy and control. You're shot that day." He paused, the memory clearly still rankling. It disrupted that order. "So this was punishment," Eliza said, understanding crystallizing. "This was a test," he corrected. "A military unit cannot function with wildcards. I needed to know if you would break or conform." Eliza thought of Lieutenant Marquez's support, of the team she'd slowly won over, of the local craftsman's gift that had saved her during the equipment malfunction. None of that had been engineered by Harker. "And your conclusion, sir?" The general's expression remained unreadable. "You're still standing. But remember, Sergeant, exceptional skill doesn't exempt you from the chain of command." After dismissal, Eliza walked slowly back to the barracks, the desert night cool against her heated skin. Her faith in the system she dedicated herself to had cracked, but something else had solidified within her. A certainty that her worth wasn't defined by Harker's approval or anyone else's. She would forge her own path, even within these rigid confines. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She would face them on her own terms. Dawn broke over the Arizona desert, bathing the training grounds in a copper glow as Sergeant Eliza Rowan adjusted her rifle strap. The final field exercise, the culmination of a year's worth of trials, humiliation, and hard-won victories, stretched before her team like a gauntlet of fire and sand. Remember, this isn't just about marksmanship, Lieutenant Marquez murmured, his weathered face etched with concern. It's about leadership, coordination, everything you've learned. Eliza nodded, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down heavier than her pack. The exercise combined navigation, tactical decision-making, and precision shooting, a perfect storm designed to test every weakness she'd worked to overcome. In the distance, she spotted Corporal Jennings watching her, his expression unreadable but his intention clear. Today would decide everything. The exercise began with a grueling trek across shifting terrain. Eliza's team moved as one unit, her quiet commands guiding them through the obstacles General Harker had personally designed. Each step felt like a reclamation of ground, physical and metaphorical, that she'd fought for all year. "Hostiles at 2 o'clock, she whispered. Spotting the training dummies positioned strategically across a ravine, the shot required would be nearly impossible, wind gusting unpredictably, distance pushing the limits of their equipment. Captain Doyle appeared on the ridge above, binoculars trained on her team. "Waiting for you to fail, Rowan?" His voice carried down. "Some shots just can't be made." The words echoed his taunt from that first day, but this time, Eliza felt only calm certainty. She positioned herself, remembering the craftsman's words about the modified scope. Marquez's lessons on patience, even the night she'd spent lost in the desert, learning to trust herself when everything else disappeared. She took the shot. The crack of her rifle silenced everything. Through her scope, she watched the target fall with precision that left no room for doubt or dismissal. Her team erupted in controlled celebration as they secured their objective, completing the exercise with record efficiency. Later, as they returned to base, Captain Doyle intercepted her. "Congratulations," he said, the words sharp as broken glass. "You've proven yourself quite the shot. But remember, some victories cost more than they're worth." He walked away, shoulders rigid with resentment. Marquez found her packing her gear. "You changed things today," he said quietly. "Not just for yourself." Eliza looked across the barracks, where her team prepared for evening mess, no longer separated from her by invisible barriers. "Was it worth it?" she asked. The lieutenant smiled. "That's not for me to say, but I'm staying, and that's something I wasn't sure of yesterday." Eliza shouldered her pack, the desert sunset painting the base in gold and shadow. One chapter ending, another beginning, with a single impossible shot. The Arizona sun cast long shadows across the training base as Sergeant Eliza Rowan cleaned her rifle one final time before stowing it away. The weapon that had once been just standard-issue equipment now felt like an extension of herself, a partner in the journey that had transformed her from an outsider to someone the unit couldn't imagine being without. She glanced across the barracks where Corporal Jennings sat, his expression no longer burning with resentment, but settled into something resembling grudging respect. Their rivalry had evolved into a strange form of mutual recognition. He nodded slightly when their eyes met. Not friendship, but acknowledgement of a worthy opponent. "Coffee's ready," Lieutenant Marquez called, performing the evening ritual that had once excluded her. Now, Eliza took her place naturally among the circle of soldiers, accepting the steaming cup with a quiet smile. The bitter liquid tasted of belonging. "Tell us again about that first shot," one of the newer recruits asked, eyes wide with admiration. 2,400 meters, another whispered reverently. Eliza shook her head. "The distance wasn't what mattered," she said, watching the desert darkness gather outside. "It was everything that came after." Captain Doyle passed by the open doorway, his shoulders stiff. The officer still couldn't bring himself to join these gatherings when she was present. His resentment had calcified into something permanent, a reminder that not all victories win universal acclaim. Yet even his continued coldness couldn't diminish what she had accomplished. Earlier that day, General Harker had summoned her to his office. The man who had engineered so many of her obstacles stood rigid as ever, but something had shifted in his assessment. "The military needs soldiers who can withstand more than just enemy fire, Sergeant," he had said, his voice still lacking warmth, but carrying a new note of finality. "It needs those who can withstand doubt, sabotage, and isolation. You've proven yourself adequate in that regard." From General Harker, adequate was high praise indeed. As darkness fell completely, the familiar sounds of the base settled around them. Distant radio chatter, the hum of vehicles returning from patrol, laughter from the mess hall. Marquez caught her eye across the circle and raised his cup slightly. He had decided to stay, to help build the kind of unit that valued strength without crushing spirit. "Your shot changed things here," he said quietly when the others had drifted away. Eliza shook her head. "Not the shot," she corrected. "Standing back up every time they knocked me down, that's what did it." The desert had taught her that endurance wasn't about never falling. It was about rising from the sand again and again, until standing became as natural as breathing.